want to say thank you so much for doing this interview with me today. I know that you have had quite a bit of travel lately, and I read on your blog, I think, that you were writing yourself a list of things to do and you just stopped at 26 because it started to seem too daunting. And this probably wasn't even on your list. So,
No, it wasn't.
so every moment that we spend on this call, we're keeping you from your list.
Well,
And
I think this would be one of the more pleasant ones, though, of all the things on the list.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm especially excited that you're our April featured author, and April is Poetry Month, and you are a renowned children's poet. So maybe you could just tell me if you have any special plans for Poetry Month this year.
Oh, I think I have a number of interviews. No particular plans for April as such. There will be a reading of my work here this coming Sunday, actually. And just a little bit after this interview with you now, I will be going off to rehearsal.
Oh,
Uh, on Sunday, there will be a reading of my work by a professional acting troupe. And
wow.
they started this as a series last fall with the fellow, they want to feature Missouri authors, so now I'm the second one in the series. So they'll be reading, and I'll be one of the readers, some of my poetry, and as well as stories and other things. So I'm very pleased about that. That doesn't technically qualify for Poetry Month, but it qualifies for a nice time for me.
Right, right. Wow, that's really amazing. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. Yeah,
Um,
it's a good feeling. I'm very flattered, and I hope that somebody shows up to hear it.
oh, I'm sure they will. I would if I were there. Actually,
As
so
far as
that,
April is concerned, I don't have any specific plans
well,
for
you do. You're the featured author for 12 by 12.
That's true. Absolutely. I should not forget that.
Okay, so I knew this would happen because you're always fascinating to talk to, but so I've already thought of a question that isn't even on my list. When you raised the point about poetry or performing your poetry,
Uh-huh.
and in this case, it sounds like you have other people who are also going to be performing your poetry, but
Right.
is that something that comes naturally to you, or is that something that you practiced over time? Because reading your work aloud is very different from writing it. And I don't know, sometimes I find that even with my own work, I feel self conscious and I'm sort of stilted and maybe not as expressive as I could be.
I think we all suffer from that. I've developed a habit over time of reading my poetry, especially poetry, actually almost anything I write, I read aloud, and draft and draft and draft and draft. And each time, as I read it aloud, I not only become more familiar with it and more comfortable reading it aloud, but I also hear those glitches that need to be solved. I'm pretty comfortable getting up and reciting or reading.
Right.
However, it does take a certain amount of hands. You simply have to learn to be comfortable being a little bit dramatic at times. The old school reading poetry was to read it rather woodenly, that the words alone are supposed to carry the day. But frankly, that's boring to a lot of people. And if you sit there and listen to this monotone voice very long, even the best of poetry begins to become sort of ho hum, and
Hmm.
you miss some of the intent of the poem. There's nothing wrong with reading your poetry the way you feel it, the way you
Right.
hope that other people will hear it.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because with poetry versus picture books, where I mean, some picture books are written in rhyme or more poetic than others say, but if it's a narrative story, it's a little bit different because punctuation is going to help and so on. Whereas a poem, I think there's more open to interpretation in terms of how you might read it or what emphasis you would place. For example, if you listen to somebody else read one of your poems, do you learn things that you wouldn't otherwise learn if you're just reading it yourself?
Occasionally it's informative, sometimes it's punishment.
Hmm.
But still, in either case, it's a reminder that we all hear differently
Right.
and all read aloud differently. We have different tones and different meters to our own voice, different cadence.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so sometimes it's helpful, and as I say, sometimes it's just interesting to
Mm-hmm.
hear how someone else hears what I heard.
Well, it's also it's interesting to me too that it's a good reminder that once we put our work out into the world, that's when we lose control, really.
Oh,
You don't know how somebody's going to read it or interpret it. And with respect to, the 12 by 12 members, we're really craft focused. We're critiquing and getting feedback. And one of the things I hear sometimes when you give a critique or vice versa, for me, I've learned that the more defensive I am, the more likely that the person is onto something in their in their
oh,
critique. But there's also this tendency to sort of start explaining, well, I put that there because, this and this and this and this, and it's really meant to be read like this. And it's a
right.
reminder that we don't go with our books. Um, so the work
Well said.
eventually has to stand on its own, and you have to have the faith in your reader, and you have to give them enough.